Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another of our Living History programs. These are really an extension of our ongoing oral history project. We've recorded now almost 1,400 interviews with people from around the world about their memories of President Kennedy and the day of the assassination, and also the history and culture of the time period. And we believe that everyone has a story worth sharing. So if you'd like to add your voice to this tapestry of living history, it's really easy. You can contact us via our website, jfk.org. And if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we can do an interview here at the museum. If you live outside the area, we can always do a telephone interview. But we are always looking for new voices to add to this. And every so often, we find a really remarkable storyteller in the project, and we like to invite those folks back for a living history program like we have today. Bob Welch has a very rich story to tell. He has an almost Forrest Gump-like experience from the 1960s, considering that he covered the Kennedy assassination and then went on to cover riots in Washington after the death of Martin Luther King, and he was a combat photographer during the Vietnam War. Such a rich story, and we're going to touch on some of the highlights of that today. If you would, please join me in welcoming Bob Welch to tell his story today. Bob, we're going to take a look at you from the weekend of the assassination. There you are in Dealey Plaza as it is actively being transformed into a memorial shrine after the assassination. But let's go back a little further. You joined the NBC affiliate, WBAP, in 1959.
Right.
And you were more than just
part of 59.
You were more than just a cameraman. You were a reporter. You were a one-man show. Tell us a little bit about how you would cover a story all by yourself.
Well, at the time, we didn't think that much of it, but by today's standards, it's different. We would both find the story, film the story, shoot the story, interview the story if needed, edit the story, narrate the story, do everything. So we were called, quote unquote, one-man band. And that's what we did. Burl Ives is a name that comes to mind when I think in terms of what I did. I didn't think it was so much, but he reminded me that possibly it was. Some of you out here possibly remember Burl Ives. It was a folk singer, and at the event, he was at Love Field, and it was my assignment to interview, whatever, which I did. And he brought to my attention how great thou art in so many words, and could not believe that I was the same person shooting this outside, inside, reverse shots, everything, interviewing him, doing everything with him. He's used to union shops where they'd have people doing individual jobs, and he commented on that, and I've remembered it to this moment because it brought to my attention possibly the uniqueness of what this was to other people in union shops. So it made me feel pretty good.
Before we talk about your activities on November 22nd, 1963, I want to go back a little earlier in that year when someone took a shot at Major General Edwin Walker at his home on Turtle Creek. Now, Walker, we're seeing a picture of Walker here, not from the day of the shooting, but from another time. You covered Walker several times. In fact, in this photograph, you're visible there in the far corner in shirt sleeves with your camera, and your WBAP mobile cruiser is visible there in the background as well in front of Walker's house. But something happened in April of '63 when someone took a shot at Walker. Tell us a little bit about going to his house that night.
Okay. We were familiar with General Walker, who handled a lot of the racial disturbances going on in Little Rock. He was the commanding officer. Raise of hands. Are you familiar with General Walker? Just so I know who I'm talking. Okay, you got it. Are most of you folks from out of state? Away from this area?
Maybe we should preface this by saying that the Warren Commission concluded in 1964 that it was Lee Harvey Oswald in April of 1963 that fired at General Walker at his home on Turtle Creek Boulevard. There's some controversy about that, but that's what the Warren Commission concluded. So go ahead. You were there that night.
Yeah, that's what happened. And what happened was I was working the 2 to 10 shift at Channel 5, and which later has become KXAS from WBAP. And I was almost into my driveway in Irving, Texas, when the police scanner, the police radio, was talking about a shooting in the Turtle Creek area. Well, that's a pretty high-powered area here in Dallas. And I was familiar with General Walker and flying the flag upside down and all this. And so my ears perked up, and I said, I got to get over there. So I just did a quick U-turn and headed for Turtle Creek. And luckily, I got there in time to get the detective. At the time, we had more accessibility than they do sometimes today. And I have all that on film in one thing or another.
The bullet went through the window and
Right.
lodged in the wall.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm shooting the whole thing. So anyway, got this great film. Of course, it turns out, a little while later, Oswald was in the major leagues and performed what he did, or was one of them. And so I had a great story there in my mind, and we had a 12 o'clock news slot, which I thought would be ideal. It allowed me to present a story that otherwise might not have been. We were the only station there. So anyway, to show you how it works, big-time TV, nothing works as wonderfully as you think it will, even on the highest levels. And so they didn't have time. The Alex Burton, he didn't have time for my story, which of course had Oswald, because the submarine had gone down. Of all things, with the whole crew going down. Big story. I didn't have anything to do with anything. I didn't know about it. So anyway, that wiped me out, and I think it made air the next day because it had to, because it was a news story. But we had the exclusive film on that. So
Right.
that was quite a...
Walker was important because he was one of the leaders of the far ultra right wing in Dallas, which
Bruce Alger and General Walker.
and these folks, the John Birch Society members, they gained a lot of attention in the early 60s, which led many people, including yourself, to have some reservations about President Kennedy's trip in November. Tell us about the premonition, the bad feeling you had the morning of the assassination.
It's interesting that you remember all this.
It's my job.
He's a piece of work here. My wife was preparing me breakfast on the day that I was scheduled to go out and cover the ordeal. And I told her, I don't remember my exact words anymore, but I was at the counter sitting on a bar stool. I said, I don't really know what's going on here, but I don't feel really good about this. Something's going to happen, or to that effect. It actually happened like that. And, of course, what followed was my premonition coming to fruition. So that was interesting. My mother-in-law, who was in Jacksboro, Texas, was washing dishes at the sink when she heard her worthless son-in-law telling her that the president had been shot.
On the radio.
So I climbed up the ladder a little bit at that moment.
We'll get to that radio broadcast. We're actually going to hear a little bit of it. But let's start with Love Field. Now, you are in this picture. In fact, you are very visible right next to President Kennedy there with your camera. Now, Bob, tell us a little bit about your impressions of Kennedy in person. What was it like to be that close to him on that day?
I'm telling you, he was one of the most impressive. Of course, the charisma and the build-up and all that's part of it. But he was so impressive. He had on a white shirt with narrow green stripes through it. He had a beautiful tie. He had a suit that had a green flavor to it. His red hair was red. His gorgeous wife was there in their pink outfit. It was just really quite an issue. I just was very impressed with it. And, you're hearing about how scary Dallas was and didn't like Kennedy. There were throngs and throngs, hundreds and hundreds of people there. It was just a large throng of people. But he was one of the most impressive figures. I bought into the whole thing. I was an easy catch. I don't even know if I voted. I think I voted for Nixon. And it had nothing to do with being Catholic or anything. It was just, that's what I did, I think.
We have another picture here, and Bob, again, you're visible, and we can see you sort of peeking behind the viewfinder of your camera there, right up close and personal. And,
Right.
and you got as close as you could and really just followed Kennedy the whole time. In fact, we have a series of pictures in which your camera is always there. You're sort of always in the background there.
Yeah, that's how we worked.
Now, one of the ways it's really easy to identify you is there's a little Channel 5 decal on the camera, and that was your idea. Tell us about that.
Well, that's an interesting tale. We're always into self-promotion in the media because, and we'd go out on assignments all the time, and people would always ask, "What station are you from?" I said, "Well," I said, there's something we can do to put ourselves where we're not constantly asked, what station are we from and what time will it be on the air? So I came up with a design that I thought was appropriate that would fit on the front of on the camera. It wasn't ostentatious, it wasn't overly large, but it had a 5 on it. And that eliminated much of that, and that was my idea, which came to fruition. I was very proud of that. And of course, now you can see why it shows up like it does.
Yeah.
It's an oval shaped. And I designed the bloom. I'm not an artist, but anyway, it worked. And so that's the story there.
Well, we've been seeing you with your camera all over Love Field, so let's actually take a look at some of the film you shot that day. And you had sound on your camera.
Right.
So we're going to watch and listen to a little clip of Bob Welch's footage from Love Field.
Yeah. Remember the faces. Got a woman crying. You see how excited everybody is, how gorgeous the setting is? Governor Conley in front of him with his wife Nellie. Mel Couch there, chalet.
Yep. Now that sequence we just saw of you on Jackie's side of the car, here's a photograph taken by Tom Dillard of the Morning News, and there you are back there in the background shooting that piece of footage that we just watched.
That's later on. He actually started, I was where he was.
Right.
And by the time
they're starting to drive away there.
Yeah, that's ironic. You should find that, Stephen.
Well, now you were there at Love Field with Jimmy Darnell of WBAP, and then your assignment was to then go to the Trade Mart for the luncheon. Tell us a little bit about what happened and how you found out about the shooting.
Okay. Love Field, of course, is well represented, what we discussed so far. And so I got in the news car and headed for the Trade Mart, which is a large building off of one of our main thoroughfares. And that's where he was to speak. And he addressed some of the luminaries of Dallas-Fort Worth area. I was outside. There were inside people and outside people. I was outside people. And I was awaiting the arrival to film the arrival of the motorcade. I'm standing next to a bank of police motorcycles, long line of motorcycles. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, no warning, there's been a shooting in the motorcade. Those words stuck with me and stayed with me long enough at the time that I mentioned that exact wording in my delivery of what was going on in Dallas. Mm-hmm. It made an impression on me. Anyway, as that was happening, the motorcade was going right by. Wes, are you awake? I didn't want to put my son-in-law to sleep. He's had a long day. And so they were actually going by, and I could see Jackie over the wife, over the president. Pink hat was very easy to see. The suit was also pink. And they flashed on by on the way to Parkland Hospital. I shot that. I filmed it as fast. It's very fast. I ran to my news car, which was very near. The proximity was good. I jumped in the news car and took after the motorcade, which is really a no-no. You don't want to follow ambulances and emergency vehicles, and it's kind of a no-no, known by myself, but I ignored the fact because of what. And so I was following them in the Warren report. If you actually read the whole report, it mentions one of the agents in the car saying, "There's a car following way too close to us. What do you want us to do?" Of course, they're all armed. True story. So anyway, we're going down Harry Hines Boulevard, and they make way for the motorcade to pass the gate. And, of course, I'm following suit, and I want to go through the gate. And they see the difference and cut me off. That was the end of my ride.
Let's listen to your radio broadcast real quick. And this is you reporting the shooting of President Kennedy, and we're going to be looking at a picture of the motorcade as it made its way down the freeway.
In the 20s, yeah.
Police radios are carrying that the president has been hit. The president's party, his wife, the governor, senators, and all other political officials were en route as fast as they could get there to Parkland Hospital. From Dallas, Bob Welch, WBAP Radio News.
All right. And it took a little bit of effort to get that broadcast on the air. Do you want to just briefly tell us the links that you had to go through to get that on the air?
Right. I'm amused by this now, 50-something years later, but at the time it was frustrating. Big-time television, Dallas-Fort Worth market. I think we were 8th or 10th in the United States. But everybody in their wisdom, with the president in town, went home for lunch at that hour that he was in a parade in downtown Dallas. So I'm trying so hard to get word out, knowing what I've learned. There's nobody in the newsroom to hear what I'm trying to tell them, which was that. What we did then, because technology was so backward at that time by today's standards, was I'd have to talk on my two-way radio, which we were equipped with in our news units. That would be transferred over to a tape. The audio tape would then be taken to the radio studio or TV out, whatever, and aired. Immediate. This is immediate stuff. But the only guy in the newsroom is a cameraman that had shot or that had filmed, I have to be careful with my terminology here, that had filmed the president in Fort Worth speaking at the Worth Hotel. So Floyd Bright is his name, and he took my announcement. As I say, I'm a busy little guy. I'm following the motorcade. And then he tells me when I'm finished, and I did a marvelous job. Normally I'm not an air person. I was a good reporter, but I didn't do a lot of radio air, so it was sort of a miracle that I got all that out of my mouth without being a stumble bum about it. So what does he tell me? Big time media. He tells me, "Bob, you're going to have to do it again." The first time didn't work. No time for arguing or discussion. It's just the way the world turns or churns. And so I had to do that again. And so what you just heard, the reality of it, which I think is interesting in media terms, is that what you hear isn't my first take. And the good Lord blessed me with the ability to do it again. As frustrating as that must have been to me. And I did it again. Anyway, they think, or people that have told me this, we won numerous citations and awards and that sort of thing. They tell me it was the energy in my presentation following the motorcade that excited the judges of all these contests. We had all the follow footage and everything that everybody had. But that particular newscast was so powerful in my presentation of it, second time, that it set the tone for a winning entry. Now, I don't know if that's interesting to you or not, but I think that's an interesting part of reality.
And certainly after the Kennedy assassination, this would have been a very competitive field of entries, all the local coverage of the shooting in Oswald and everything. I want to keep us on track and take us to Parkland now. We are here in a nurse's classroom with Malcolm Kilduff, the Assistant White House Press Secretary, and there you are, Bob, front and center with your camera. And you might notice that in Bob's hands, he is holding a microphone. And we're very fortunate
My left hand.
that Bob Welch was there that day in that nurse's classroom, because Bob Welch was the only person to capture the sound recording of Malcolm Kilduff making the announcement of President Kennedy's death. We're going to show that whole clip, and it is extremely dramatic. Bob, I want to go ahead and play that and then have you tell us what it was like to be there in the room when he announced the death of President Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy. We'll do it again. Go on, Matt. President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain.
Slow it down.
I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president.
Anything about the shooting, the shooter, the sniper?
No, we have no information on that.
Was Mrs. Kennedy hit?
Mrs. Kennedy was not hit.
Was Connolly hit?
Governor Connolly was hit.
Was Vice President Johnson hit?
The vice president was not hit.
Has the Vice President taken a oath?
No.
Can we see him?
He has left.
Where did he go? Where can we find
I'm
him?
sorry, for reasons of security, I cannot discuss the whereabouts or travel plans of the vice president.
What's Connolly's condition?
I understand that Governor Connolly's condition is satisfactory. He was shot twice, once apparently in the side and once in the wrist.
Which one? Which wrist?
I'm sorry, Bob, I don't know.
You say
How many
it.
times was the President shot?
The president was shot once
Where is Mrs.
in the head. Mrs. Kennedy will be returning to Washington.
Mac, the President died. Was he dead on arrival here?
No, he was not.
Mac, what?
No, he did not.
He did not lose consciousness?
No, he did not regain consciousness.
Mac, where's Mrs. Kennedy going?
Mrs. Kennedy will return to Washington. Yes.
Who's with her now?
We're just friends who are on the trip. I
Anything on swearing in?
get into individuals. No.
When will the
I beg your pardon?
new president be sworn in?
As soon as possible. Where and when that will be, I cannot tell you.
Will we be notified so we can be present?
You will be notified.
Where
It may
shall
not.
we go?
It may not be in a place where you can be present. However, the details I'll make available to you.
This is the old section you're talking about, Mac?
Where should we repair to? Where should we go?
I would suggest that you stay right here. Any further information, I will either come up and give you myself, or I will have Mr. Hawks come up and give you.
Mac, can we have a doctor? What's his name?
Killed up.
Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
Wow. Extraordinary stuff, and you're the only person that captured the sound in that room.
That's an amazing thing when you think about it. Major media, major city, no podunk and Bob, big-time television channels everywhere. And you notice that I would give myself an F on camera work. Number one, the camera's fairly heavy. And I was tired by this time. You had to know your way around the hospital, first of all, to find this room where he was to do his thing. A lot of the New York media and that sort of thing couldn't find it, which is probably why I ended up with Lone's audio, which is a blessing because that's the only factual account that's known to me anyway about his dying. I was being jostled around, people trying to ask questions and that sort of thing, and I couldn't react to it. So that's why the camera work is shaky, for all those reasons. I'm not making excuses, I'm just stating a fact. And the microphone there was a real blessing because it allowed what happened to happen. I later met Kilduff in Dallas at one of the hotels and reminded him that I was there, and we discussed the whole thing. He's since has passed on. Interestingly enough, so you can, again, get back to the real world of this thing, we were an NBC affiliate station at the time. Now we're an owned station by NBC, KXAS, not WAP. So we had a box where the film would be developed in Fort Worth. We were Fort Worth station. We were going up against Dallas. Dallas had tons of people. We had 4. I put my film, I told my people that I'm putting the film in the box. It's there. I'm heading back to Dallas. Well, there happened to be a very aggressive cameraman, reporter, or more cameraman than a reporter. His name is Mo Levy from NBC, and he covered Dallas events big time. He climbed on my news unit one time covering a parade, and when he climbed up on the news unit, his sneakers scraped off my W off the back of my news unit. And I just jerked him off there and told him what I thought about all that. So we never really talked that much after that, but he had the audacity to scrape off my decals. Well, anyway, he took my film out of our box. Imagine if you did what you did, and it's gone. Sent it to New York, along with all of his film. He didn't have any of this. We can't find it. I'm being made out to look like a liar. You know, I couldn't have done that. I wasn't a liar. I was telling you what happened later as I found out. So a year later, my wife and I are watching television news. This was one of the earlier anniversaries. Am I boring anybody yet?
No, Bob.
Okay, I tend to overstate things. We were watching TV on the first anniversary, and the lead-off for that whole hour special was my Kilduff footage announcing that Kennedy had died.
First time you saw it was
First time I saw
a year
it.
later.
Yeah, but I know what happened, he told. But anyway, so New York had it all this time. What a dirty trick. You know, if they would have asked, we would have given, you know, it would have happened eventually. And so that's what happened, real life.
Now, Bob,
That's the biggest story of the century, so to speak, and screw-ups everywhere in terms of getting things done properly.
well, speaking of it being the biggest story of the 20th century, you're a young man in the midst of all of this.
20s.
How do you balance the professionalism of being a reporter-photographer with just the reaction you're having personally of the president dying?
That's a good question, Stephen. I may have answered it earlier, I don't remember. It was tough. I'm an emotional person, as you can probably tell. I'm not a private individual that crawls into a closet or something for the most part when I was busy. You had to be to do the job, or you couldn't do it. And so here I am thinking. I didn't have a lot of time to think. That was a blessing in a way, because I was so dadgum busy. I mean, I did everything from interview the judge, Judge Sarah T. Hughes at the time, who swore in the president at the Love Field and the Jet. Interviewed her. Will Fritz, the homicide detective who's in charge of homicide, got him. All the principals. Oswald coming through the hallway, Ruby and all that sort of. No, actually, Ruby was a different story. But anyway, all that was happening. So I was exhausted, but I never would have told you that. I don't think I ever felt that way, because the adrenaline was pumping. Now, most of your reporters and photographers from that era were very good. There wasn't a lot of politics and all that sort of thing. There were some husband-wife outfits going on, but they were both equally talented. So we had a good crew of people. But it's always been interesting to me for you out-of-towners here, if you can think of St. Paul and whatever. that a Fort Worth TV station at the time, which only a four-man bureau, was as successful in recognizing our efforts in this particular story over Dallas stations.
Bob, I want to jump ahead to 1964 real quick, the Jack Ruby trial. You were in the midst of that as well. Here's a picture of Jack Ruby's attorneys.
Marvin Belli.
Yeah, we have Melvin Belli here, Joe Tonnahill, and Phil Burleson, Ruby's attorneys, and then right over here, Bob Welch, covering that for WBAP. Bob, tell us a little bit about the Ruby trial. Jack Ruby went on trial in February and March, right across the street here in the criminal courts building. What was that like for you to cover?
It was interesting. I'm looking at that picture and I'm wondering, what am I doing? I mean, all the action's in front of me.
Well, you're clearly posing for the photographer.
I don't know what
Bill
I'm doing.
Winfrey.
There's Charlie Murphy on the right and Gary DeLon, people who are familiar to me. I can't figure out what I'm doing.
Now,
But
you
anyway,
didn't
I was
know
there.
Ruby. You didn't know Ruby personally.
I did not know him.
Okay. What was it like to cover that trial?
I didn't really cover, and I was pretty active. We didn't really do that much day in and day out of the trial. It was known what had happened. It's stupid sometimes to me to have trials for some of this stuff, and including current events, where like where the bombing explosion, Boston. I mean, these people are so guilty, it's coming out of their pores. You know what? Fort Hood. What are we doing, wasting taxpayers' money and running this stuff every day when they're so guilty? They tell you they're guilty, and we're spending thousands and thousands of dollars.
All right.
It's ridiculous. Well, that's the way it was.
Now, Bob, there was a jailbreak during the Jack Ruby trial. We have one of the guys here who broke out of the Dallas County Jail, and this was unconnected to the trial, but it happened in full view of the media. And
it happened in full view of me.
Well, you were there, but there you are here with your camera. It looks like you're winding up the camera, and you're here with one of the escapees from as he's being brought back. All of them were apprehended. But tell us.
There's only one.
No, there were 7.
One.
Okay.
On this particular, I'm sorry, Steve.
It's okay.
God, I don't want to say anything to hurt your.
Well, this is one of this.
No, this is one. One guy got out of jail. He had a soap gun.
Yes. There were other people that got out at the same time, but that's okay.
That may have happened.
Okay.
I am not infallible. There are things that have happened that I can.
Well, let's look at another
Don't
picture
get me
of you.
lying here.
There you are in the background. Again, you're right there. You're the only guy with a camera in the room, but there you are in the corner as he's being searched, brought back into jail. One of the main individual that escaped had carved a gun out of soap with black shoe polish. But you were there when he was escaping, and he had a hostage. Just tell us a little bit about that hostage situation.
That was really interesting. That if everybody in this room could experience events like we're discussing here today, it'd blow your mind, because this stuff stays with you. You know, you don't forget the gun pointing at you. Anyway, he's coming down the stairs with a very familiar older woman who's a bailiff in the court of Judge Joe B. Brown, who is hearing on the second floor of the building, the Ruby trial. Jimmy Kerr, my bureau chief, said, "Bob, you need to get up there and get some footage." At that time, we could get into the courtrooms. We were friendly to them, they were friendly to us. We'd sign police statements. We didn't treat each other like dogs. We were honest about things, for the most part. And she's coming down, and God bless her, I can still see her. She's rather large, tall, and she's petrified, and she's verbally active, and she's saying, "Please, don't shoot," talking to the guy holding her like this. And her arms are flailing, and he says, "Just get out of the way, please, just let him go," because I'm there. I'm midway up the staircase, not knowing all this was happening. And I'm sure I'm annoying him. Annoying the hell out of him, actually. And, excuse me, Eldon. Sorry. annoying him. I'm sure I was an annoyance, like a splinter in your finger. And he had the gun. I had a camera. And let me tell you, that soap, the gun was made of soap painted black. He was a craftsman. It looked like a gun. Didn't look like a bar of soap at all. And it was large. You could see everything. And I swear to God, I figured that was going. Anyway, he's coming down the stairs, and I'm shooting him coming down. It goes right by me. I was looking at the gun, and I just stayed with it as long as the wind lasted, which was a long time. You had to wind the cameras. So anyway, he's now going backwards, looking at the deputies and people like myself who are staring at him, and he's going backwards through the glass doors to the street. Well, from my position, it looked like his gun was pointed right at me. Now, I've been to NAM and all kinds of things that happened, but I never felt like I was so close to being shot in my life as I was at that moment. I was just waiting to get hit. Never got hit. The gun couldn't fire. It was made out of soap. But we didn't know that. We didn't know that. So I followed him all the way around the building, then made a left turn, still following him. And you can tell he's annoyed. And then got to the corner, quite a distance, and then we crossed the main street where there was a parking lot right here full of cars. And a sheriff's deputy, God bless him, he's very unhero-like. His name is Charles Player. He was in charge of the reserve sheriff's people. Reserves. He'd teach classes and things, secondary type stuff. Well, anyway, Charlie had the kahunas to get the job done. He comes crossing the cars from one hood to the next, unseen by the fugitive, who's walking backwards, looking at people like
Careful,
myself.
Bob. We don't want you to fall
And I'm going
backwards.
to go backwards. That would be a piece of footage there. And so Player, if you can imagine, is crossing this bank of cars, then onto the pavement, and now he's waiting for the arrival of this convict whose back is to him. Charlie's just standing here like this. So he says, "Hand over your weapon." That was it. He handed over the weapon. All the 5 million deputies who were following and everything captured him, took them back to this event. I don't even remember this.
If you have questions for Mr. Welch, if you will pass those to the end of your rows, we'll collect those and go through a few. Bob, you have so
I
many.
do sign autographs.
You have so many stories. You've done 4 or 5 hours worth of oral histories. You and I. I do want to put a couple pictures up on the screen here. This is you covering Vietnam as a combat photographer for NBC. An extraordinary experience. You were there for several months doing that. And you were also in Washington, D.C., at the Washington, D.C. Bureau of NBC when Dr. King was killed.
I was at Washington. It wasn't a bureau. It was a big facility.
Okay.
That one again, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
This is the truth.
But you were in Washington for NBC in 1968 when King was killed, and you covered the riots that took place in D.C.
Terrible.
While we're waiting for the questions, tell us the story of being in the car in the fog and seeing the guys in the riot gear.
That's good that you remembered that. Thank you. There's a massive riot going on in D.C. Martin Luther King had been shot. Majority of the people in D.C. are black people. They weren't happy, and it showed. And, of course, I'm a white guy, and I had a white crew. I was a union person then. I had a white sound man and a white electrician and my little white face in a very difficult situation. We're sitting in the car at the particular moment Steve referenced, and there's a lot of smoke, and they're throwing up all kinds of things to make it hard for people to do what they were trying to do and cause damage and that sort of thing. So we're sitting in the car. I can't see past the hood, okay? You've been in a car and you've had fog and you're looking out the window and you don't see anything. Well, that's what we were doing, 3 of us. All of a sudden appears a whole quadrant of masked, helmeted, bayoneted people walking right up to the car and then made way through where my car took up space and went right by us. That's a picture for you to ponder. But they were serious about it. The looting was terrible. The destruction was terrible, and we were involved in all of that. And the police were shooting up at the buildings, and the people were running around with refrigerators, and clothes, and everything else, just like you see in the movies or something. And we were there to photograph it, or tell the story.
Extraordinary that you were at all of these locations in the 60s, including there in the rice paddies in Vietnam during that terrible experience.
It's interesting, and possibly some of you guys that have been to Nam in one thing or another, we learned to stay in the rice paddies, which was kind of messy and spongy and uncomfortable. And the reason for that was there's dikes running along, and then the rice paddies in the middle, rice being grown. Well, if you walk on the hard ground, the Vietnamese, the NVA, the bad guys, put punji stakes into because they knew Americans didn't want to get wet and messy. We wanted to walk on the dikes. Well, we did that for long enough and found all we were doing was getting hurt. And you'd step on the punji stake, which was a stick shaped like a point, and then on the end of it was waste material, from manure from animals, human, whatever. So when you stepped on it, and we're walking, it's heavy, carrying a lot of weight and stuff, and when you stepped on it, it would go through your boot and then up into your leg. Now, I've actually seen that. I mean, I've been there to see guys that were hurt like that. So I was very enthusiastic about staying off the dikes. And one of my friends, which is how we got pictures of ourselves, actually, one of my friends, Bo Sue, he'd always have a still camera with him. So because he did, I was the beneficiary of a lot of things that otherwise I wouldn't even remember. And this is just two of them here. But that was a point of interest, that you couldn't walk on the high ground for fear of that being a problem. You couldn't tell the enemy. You couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys. It wasn't like we all were in uniform. Well, we were wearing uniform. We were easy. They could see us, but we couldn't tell who was.
Let's take a few questions.
Yeah.
Most of these actually all ask the same question.
Can I give them an autograph?
Well, I'm sure that is implied. Do you feel that Oswald acted alone? Do you feel that there was a conspiracy? What are your views today?
Boy, that's a deep, deep trench you dig in there.
That's why I asked it first.
I'm a lot smarter than I was 52 years ago in terms of things. Just for your own info, there's been tons and tons of theories about people doing different events. Some of them, as I told you earlier this week or later, some of them very, very persuasive. And they have all kinds of backup people who would substantiate what they were saying in light of Oswald being the lone gunman from the Perch. So here's a perfect example. Back then, when you were innocent and dumb, didn't know anything other than what you saw and experienced and reported, a reporter friend of mine and myself were invited to talk to a class which was about the assassination of Kennedy, taught by a professor who wasn't there. I thought that was kind of creepy. I mean, he wasn't there, so all he knows is what he's reading or what he's told. To me, there's enough people at that time that were available that probably could have taught that class better. But anyway, we were there, and the key question that the students were asked, I'm sorry for ignoring you, I'm tranced by my family being
it's
there.
your story. Go ahead.
This is my family. We were there in front of a full class of people at University of Texas at Arlington, and the one question they would ask of myself, no, Hicks didn't cover it, I was the only, was, who do you think shot JFK? What do you think really happened? Well, I told him exactly the way I felt about it, with all the stories and different things flying around. I told him, I don't know. And you never saw more falling faces in your life than I was looking at out there in that audience. They were so disappointed that I wasn't able to entertain them with an informative story as to what happened during the JFK assassination. And here, 50-something years later, I am still unable, with any authentic, to tell you what happened. There's the badge man theory, which is interesting in itself. You can Google things like this and find them. There's a fellow who swears to God he was behind the wall, shot him through the temple, bit into the bullet, the shell, the casing, left it on the fence. And these are very convincing stories. And you can hear a lot of them if you go outside. These guys are making an honest living telling you a bunch of nonsense. Most of them weren't there. They're trying to sell product. They're very dramatic. And they do have an audience, but they're full of it. We did a story one time and that allowed me to hear some of their pitches. And they were so off. That reminds me, there's a movie that came out called JFK. Who's that famous
Oliver
director?
Stone.
Oliver Stone. God bless him. Oliver Stone did the movie. Have y'all seen JFK? Well, I didn't see it. And what I've learned is, I'll tell you in a minute why I didn't see it. But what I've learned is that history can be exaggerated and overplayed. And I don't just say that personally to make a statement. I've seen it over my lifetime since the assassination, where I've seen events and then I see what's reported. I was covering the riots in Chicago, at one example, and it was terrible. So now I'm finished shooting pictures of the riots, and in Washington, D.C., the riots. I'm listening to the reporters' account of what was going on the streets of both Washington and Chicago, doing things I covered. And they were so far off. They'd show pictures of demonstrators getting hammered by police with batons, both places, just getting smeared. The cops were terrible. Well, what they didn't show, which I had film of, was the police having to put down these people that were demonstrating horrific acts against the police that were retaliating to save their very lives. So when you get fanatical people that are bent on making a mess of situations, you've got to defend yourself. So these cops were literally banging them off to keep them away. There's a thin line of blue there, and there's a bunch of civilians running around causing hell in all the buildings. Well, they didn't show that. I swear to God, there was no mention of it.
Bob, several of our
And that's what I see today, too.
Yeah. Several of our audience members noticed that earlier when you were referencing Oswald and the assassination, you said Oswald was one of the guys. And they're questioning me to ask you to explain that. Do you feel that Oswald was involved with others in terms of the assassination, or was that just a slip of the tongue?
No, nothing I've said is a slip of the tongue. As I told the students back then 100 years ago at UTA, I don't know. I do know I'm a lot smarter because I've researched and used the internet and Googled things that are of interest relating to all of this. And I really don't know. They're very convincing. If you were to read and study what I've researched, Steve's book also about Dallas aftermath of the event, which is very good. It's in the library here. I don't know what to believe. The Warren Report is so shallow in factual material as to cause great concern by people who really study the assassination. The Warren Report was made up of a lot of unwilling participants, politicians and different people that were more or less gathered up, put together, and Warren was made the chairman of the board, if you will, and they had to come up with stuff. Well, a lot of it wasn't researched enough in the minds of these individuals, and they find fallacy in a lot of the Warren Report. Now, this museum here, I don't know if I should talk about this or not.
It's up to you. There's no filter
I don't
on
want
you.
to say anything harmful to hurt anybody or anything, but I will say that this museum represents a point of view which isn't accepted by a lot of people enough people out there to make a wave and cast doubt on the authenticity of the presentation that's presented here. It's a pretty impressive presentation, actually. But you have to consider this outfit here believes in the single shooter theory. Now, that hasn't always been the case. Some of staff here were along the lines of the theorist and thought they had reasonable reason to be that way. And over the years, it's become more of an institutional presentation based on Warren Report, which, as I say, is questionable to so many people like yourselves who are interested in the truth. It's hard to get to the truth of just about anything. I mean, talk about the commentator on NBC. I mean, come on. And the media is full of people like that. Even the Fox guy's been put under the gun. They tend to embellish. Now, I sound like I'm embellishing because it's just me. But really, I'm just telling you facts. That's why I was asked to come here. But some of these people make up stuff. That NBC guy says he was in a helicopter. Well, that helicopter he was in was 3 hours behind the helicopter that got shot. That's not my view of it. That's the facts of the matter. The guys that were actually there, which is usually where they get fallen down, said, hey, man, this didn't happen like he's saying. But he's making himself out to be bigger than he is.
Bob, you mentioned that you have done a lot of research on the assassination, and you actually brought a file with you today, which I think demonstrates the impressive lengths that which you've gone to gather up this material. Do you want to show that real quick? You pick it up and just hold it up?
I really do.
Okay. What this is Bob has for many, many years kept an obituary file on everybody related to the Kennedy assassination that has passed away. And this is a demonstration 50 years later of how few eyewitnesses, reporters, and police officers are still around who can share their memories about the assassination.
That's true, and I can mention many of them from this area on one hand, maybe a hand and a half. That's how many are left. I'm still on this side of the grass. I'm 79. I'll be 79 in June. But, you know, the time comes when we all leave. This right here, to me, is a beautiful example of history because each obituary is thoroughly handled from the newspaper and people who were very familiar with the subjects. And they go, everybody from the O'Neill ambulance that handled the body and transferred. I actually went to high school with Jerry O'Neill, who was the ambulance driver of the ambulance that drove. Anyway, he's gone too. But each story is so intriguing, and they're all real. And regardless, some of these people are kings and others are not. Some of them are so important you'd recognize the name immediately. Others you wouldn't know from beans. But they all had a part in the story that was part of the Kennedy story, in which I asked you, did you need, but you do your own stuff. But this sort of gives you an idea. These are skinny little pages. This is a voluminous collection. I mean, we're talking literally everybody that was covering the event is right here. Mm-hmm. And if you want to get a history lesson, you get into something like this. And I mean, you find out everything from the doctors that performed to the people that did everything that was, from the motorcycle cops that were next to the deal. And so this to me is an interesting vehicle that I think over the years my daughters will find interesting. Well, I don't know that they'll ever be read. Somebody somewhere may read them, but I've got it.
We are very fortunate that your name is not on those documents and that you are here today to share your story with us. Please join me in thanking Bob Welch for being our guest today.